Do you need an introduction?
Do I? Do I need an introduction?
Steve. Yeah.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. You don't have to adjust your dial. I'm just a taller, balder version of, and more handsome version of Pastor Bowie. For those of you who don't know, he's on the mainland. He's actually at his church, I think, where he came to know Christ after doing a little Disney trip during the busiest time of the Disney season. I'm anxious to hear his story. So he was gracious enough to ask me, and I was gracious enough to accept to speak today. I told him maybe once a year, and I think I spoke in January, so unfortunately it's kind of like on the edge of this last year. But we're going to go for it anyway. The title of the sermon today, or the message, is the Good Samaritan. And it's that time of year. Got New Year's resolutions, right? You all got them? You got your list? I'm trying to think the last time I made a New Year's resolution. But for today, just because 2020 is just around the corner, I was deep in thought, introspection, really just kind of dug deep to think about what my New Year's resolution would be for next year, this coming year. And I resolved to never make a New Year's resolution again. So we're good. All right. Don't we feel like that? 'Cause, after Christmas, we get a little beat up, right? We feel beat up as we come to the new year. We feel like, man, where have I been this last year? And some of the changes you were hoping to make throughout the year maybe didn't come through. And I think we do. We beat ourselves up a little bit. And if you think about this new year, 2020, it's a new decade, right? It seems like yesterday was, and this is my age, so I turned 50 this year. You used to sing about Prince, partying like it's 1999, or if you guys remember the Y2K bug, and now it's like 2020. And kids, if you don't know, ask your parents about that, the Y2K bug. It was almost catastrophic. But I had a plan for today. I planned to discuss thinking about the new year coming, as a year of action for 2020. The year of change, the year of becoming a better Christian. And what perfect biblical reference to look at it in the Good Samaritan. What it is. It's an illustration of kindness, of love for another, of action. And I love parables. In fact, when I was on the stage earlier this year, I spoke on the parable of the talents, or of the gold coins. And I think we all love stories, right? Normally I'm sitting out there with you guys listening to Pastor Bowie, and every once in a while, I phase out a little bit. But as soon as a story comes up, it's just like I perk back up, right? Your focus comes in when stories come around. And I think it's just human nature that we connect with stories, right? Emotions, we love them because, our history, we kind of connect through our history and our experiences. In fact, I was on the Facebook, in which my wife will say, you're on Facebook? Every once in a while. And someone was posting a little Facebook Live chat. It was one of my friends, a coach I used to coach with. And I was just going to check in for a minute. She had been struggling with cancer, and breast cancer, and she's coming through it. And she was talking, and I was like, I'll just kind of listen, get an update. 19 minutes later, I was just so engaged with the way she spoke, the way she weaved her Christmas break into our Christmas vacation into a story. Her language, her humor. It's just like, we all know someone, right, who tells good stories? Anybody here admit that they tell a good story? Okay. I'm horrible at telling stories. I started A, I ended Z, and then when I get home or I finish, I'm like, wait a minute, I missed point B, I missed point C. I'm all over the place. And I think it's one of the reasons why I use notes, because I'm not a great storyteller. In fact, when they look at, what a story does to you, we talk about engaging your emotions and your memory. When they look at brain activity, when a person is listening to a fact-filled statement versus a story, when they see the person with a story, their brain activity lights up. There's this, scientifically speaking, if you guys all know this, oxytocin is a chemical that's released when stories are told. It's known that substance in our bodies, when it's released, is known to show increases in compassion, in generosity, and trustworthiness. So it makes me think nowadays where we're going with technology, and the fact that our lives are now dictated by emojis and thumbs up and happy faces, and the art of telling a story is not what it was. But who's a great storyteller? Kids? You're supposed to say Pastor Bowie. Okay. No, he is a good storyteller, I would say. But Jesus, right? Jesus was a great storyteller. But an interesting thing happened as I started my story of the Good Samaritan. This parable we all know, and I've known since I was a child. It's even adopted in society, right? We have, news clips where they talk about who's the Good Samaritan in the community. You've heard people who don't know, the faith, they'll say, hey, he's such a good Samaritan or she's such a good Samaritan. But what's ironic is this parable is not really about being a good Samaritan. There's a good Samaritan in the story. He does some really good things, and he's really kind. But that's not the message Jesus was trying to convey or trying to get across. And I'm going to show you an image. Take a look at this image on the screen. Play a little game here. If we look at that, anybody want to take some guesses what that might be? Oh, what? No? Musicians? Could be. Yeah, open that next page up. Yeah, this is, what's that called? The part of the guitar, Dave? What's that part called? Yeah, the twisty thing, yeah. Okay. And so, that was a warm-up. Here's the next picture. I heard it. Yeah, open that up. Yeah. Ah. All right, so this is the final test. One more picture. Did someone say water? No, it's a guess. He's playing along as a teacher. I say, hey, great answer, but wrong. Let's open that one up. Okay. So this is an example of kind of reframing, right, of zooming out and seeing, like, the big picture, right? I have a classic dad example. The idea is, like, we catch one of our kids in an act of meanness to their siblings, which never happens with my family here, but, well, occasionally. And so the person in the act that I see is the one who usually gets the brunt of my wrath, right? And then when I hear the rest of the story, it's not Ethan. Oh, I didn't mean to name names, but it was it was someone else, along the way that maybe triggered that act. And maybe it was wrong, maybe it was the last act, but the idea is, like, when we get the rest of the picture, right, we tend to be like, oh, okay, maybe I should have waited. Maybe I should have got the whole picture. So I want you to think about that today, because in life, just as in life, when we read this parable, your framing is important. The question is, why is Jesus telling this story? What prompted this illustration of the Good Samaritan? Did someone ask him a question? Is he responding to some act? Too often we see what we want to see. And not to say you can't glean secondary messages and learnings and understandings, but we really want to make sure we get what Jesus really wanted us to get. So if we think about the Good Samaritan, if we were to summarize it, right? We have a man, he gets beaten and robbed on a road. A priest and a Levite pass by. They pass by the beaten man, they just walk on through. But a Samaritan stops. He helps the man in really an unexpected way. And that's really the end of the story, right? Lesson learned, right? Be kind, help others in need. And that's a great thing. But if that's all we get out of the story, then we may have missed the point. So as we unpack this parable and we see the frame around it, I hope we get a clear picture of what Jesus is trying to teach us. So if you could, turn to Luke 10. We're going to start at verse 25, and I'll give you a second to get your Bibles. Can I get my water? Because for some reason I have a dry mouth. Did I bring that up here? It's under your seat. Thank you. See, this is how fast they respond at home. Yeah. Thank you. So I'm reading from the NASB version, but I think we'll get the gist. So, and a lawyer stood up and put him to the test, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" And he said to him, "Well, what is written in the law? How does it read to you?" And he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." But wishing to justify himself, he said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" So we're going to park right there because this is the frame that I was talking about that's so important. As Jesus is teaching, a lawyer asks him a certain question. It's not just any question. It's probably the most important question you can ask, right? What can I do to inherit eternal life? That's the most important question, past, present, in the future that you could ever ask, right? I mean, isn't that the question you would want all your non-believer friends to ask you? So why does this expert, right, in the Old Testament ask this question? I mean, shouldn't he know? I mean, the fact that he's a lawyer, he's schooled in Old Testament law, he would know. And we find, if we look at verse 25, we find really the reason for his query. It says he was putting Jesus to the what? To the test, right? He was trying to trap him. He was trying to expose him. It was what a lot of them did, those leaders and those priests and the lawyers did at that time. He wasn't there to seek the truth, but he was really just trying to corner Jesus. There's some part of me, though, thinks that even in the back of his mind, even with that idea of putting him to the test, he really wanted to know how Jesus would respond. I don't know if you're familiar with that phrase, FOMO, F-O-M-O. Anybody familiar with that? It's the fear of missing out. I mean, the reality is, it's probably why you came today. Is I know when you heard Pastor Bowie wasn't going to be here, you're like, I'm checking out, but maybe Steve has some nugget. I hope I don't disappoint you. I know you're still looking. That's fine. Hey, FOMO is the reason why I don't like to take naps. I feel like I'm missing out on something. Is anybody there with me? Like I feel like if I wake up, I'm like, what happened? It's always been like that. For this lawyer, it's the idea that even with all he knew, that even with his bad intentions, maybe there was something inside of him that yearned for something beyond what he already knew. But Jesus answers this question with a question. Don't we love that? We answer a question with a question. And he asks, what does the law say? So basically telling this lawyer, hey, you should know the answer to this question. In fact, the answer to the question is what he prays every day. The Jewish people had this summation of the law that they prayed as part of their prayer every day. When we look at this prayer, it's the summation of the Ten Commandments, boiled down to really those two statements. Maybe if we can get that back up there. The fact that if you look at the Ten Commandments, we look at the first five, it's all about our relationship with God, right? The idea that we're supposed to, when you boil down, not having idols and the others, it's the idea that love your God with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind. And then you get to the second half of the Ten Commandments where it talks about do not lie, do not steal. It's all related to our relationship with others. And that second part, love your neighbor as yourself. This lawyer prayed this every day, and he knew it, right? And Jesus knows that he knows it. And Jesus replies, do this and you will, what? Do this and you will live. Meaning, if you do this, if you do these two commandments, you will live. You will have eternal life. Follow the law, love God, and love others. So now we come to this crucial juncture. How does the lawyer respond? One road would him going down was saying, okay, you know what? I fall short, right? I don't love God like I should. I don't love others like I love myself. It would be an admission that he's not perfect like the Father. He's sinful and he falls short. The other road, which he ends up taking, reveals his true intentions, that he really had no interest in wanting to know the answer. He was doing what all religious leaders do. He was trying to trap Jesus in order to condemn him. He was too self-absorbed in his status and his privilege. So his answer reveals his intentions, in justifying himself, he asks, who is my neighbor? So by going to this question of who is my neighbor, we can assume the lawyer feels that he's good with the law, right? He's good with all that. Think about all he bypasses with that question. Who is my neighbor? He's not concerned with that he's loving God with his all, or if he's properly loving his neighbor. His biggest concern is deciding, well, who is my neighbor? I check all the boxes above. I just want to make sure I'm loving the right people. So it's kind of like a guy looking at a girl that he's been dating or is in love with, and he's like, do you love me? And she looks back and kind of looks back. It's like, well, I love your hair, or I love your bald head. I love the way you dress. I love the way you look. I love the way you cook. By the way, what's for dinner? It's like avoiding, right? It's that avoidance aspect. And I think we all fall in that trap, right? That responsibility. It's like those people who say, well, I'll follow Christ when all my things are dealt with, when all my baggage is taken care of. Or, our marriage would be better if my spouse would be better to me. Or if my kids would be more respectful, then I would be a better fill in the blank, right? It's the blame game. It's this redirect that this question really points to, taking away from accountability. So this man thought he loved God perfectly and he loved others perfectly. So in his mind, unless Jesus had a different definition of a neighbor, he's all good. And unfortunately, he couldn't be further from the spiritual truth. But instead of dismissing him, what does Jesus do? He knows the road this lawyer had gone down was a dead end, but he had compassion. He figured, he could have even dismissed him, right? He said, you know what, his heart is too hard. But he attempts to give him one more insight into his depravity, right? He attempts to help him realize how far he had gotten off course. And how does he do this? He does this with a story. So let's look at the rest of the parable, and this is where we get into the parable. So let's read. Jesus replied and said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, and they stripped him and they beat him. And he went away, leaving him half dead. And by chance, a priest was going down on that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Levite also, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan who was on a journey came upon him, and when he saw him, he felt compassion. And he came to him and bandaged up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them. And he put him on his own beast and brought him to an inn and took care of him. On the next day, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper and said, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I return, I will repay you. So just so you know, just to make it clear, this story is not true, right? It didn't happen. The story's main purpose, the story why Jesus shared the story, was to crush this man's self-righteousness, to convict him to want to change. And in doing so, he wants to convict us ourselves to change. As we explore the story, it's easy to judge this man or this lawyer and all those who are involved. But by doing so, what we end up doing is judging ourselves, because we all deal with this self-righteousness. So let's unpack this. So Jesus speaks of a man going down a road from Jerusalem to Jericho. And you may have some background in this, and I didn't, but as I did a research, it's around 17 miles from Jerusalem to Jericho. It's around 4,000 feet of decline. So it's a road downhill, a winding road through caves and mountains and rocks, and it's an easy place for robbers to hide. And in this place, this man fell upon the robbers. They took everything, right? They stripped him. They left him. If you can imagine him on the side of the road or even maybe a little off the road, but visible from the road, he was beaten and he was left for dead. I mean, you couldn't imagine a more dire situation for someone to be in. If anyone needed help, this guy did. But there's hope, right? So in verse 31, we hear about a priest going down that road. I mean, next to an ambulance coming through, a priest is a good thing, right? They were servants of God. They offered sacrifices for people. They were the godliest of men. This priest, if he knew law, which he did, he knew the Old Testament, he would know Leviticus 19:34, which says to love foreigners or strangers in need. He would know this law. He would know Micah, which says to love kindness and do justice. He would know this. He would have probably been able to memorize it. But he didn't live it, right? He goes to the other side and he moves on. So some, and maybe some in the audience here might claim, well, this beaten guy is obviously not a neighbor. Maybe that's the answer the lawyer was looking for. But that's not it at all, right? This is where Jesus is trying to direct him away from that question about who should you love, but more importantly, the quality of your love. Does this priest show love? No. Did he have love for this man? Not at all. And then likewise, we have a Levite that comes by. A Levite on that whole pecking order, he wasn't a priest. He was lower on the totem pole. Right? He was an assistant. He was a helper. But in the end, he would know the law, just like the priest would. Again, if he loved God, he would have helped this man. If he loved his neighbor as himself, he would have helped this man. But as he did as well, he went the other way. So if you were to wonder if these two individuals will qualify eternal life, you would have to say No. With all their understanding of what God requires, they didn't show love for him, nor did they love their neighbor. They didn't pass the test. And I want you to pause here and ask ourselves, as we ask ourselves this question, do we pass the test? When do we look away? When do I look away? When do I choose to not to get involved? When does serving my own needs take precedence over serving others? But thankfully, the story is not done. Because as we see unfold, one more individual happens to come upon this beaten dead man, left for dead man. In verse 33, it says, "But a certain man was on a journey." Now, some would say, as people have, a Samaritan would never use this road. Right? Why? He would try to avoid Jews at all costs. But that doesn't really matter because, as I said, and as we know, this story is not true. But Jesus felt it was important enough to include this man to make a point. Samaritan and Jews historically did not mix. Right? Samaritans were despised. They were half-breeds. They have corrupted the line by intermarrying with Gentiles after captivity. They sold their birthright. They were polluted. And if you were to put this guy in a police lineup and ask the lawyer to stand behind the glass and point to his enemy, he would be pretty quick to point this guy out as an enemy. But then we look at how this Samaritan responded coming upon this bloody and beaten man. In verse 34, it says, when he saw him, he had compassion. Can you imagine the lawyer's surprise as Jesus threw this curveball of all people? Two who had religion had no compassion. One who hated loved. But let's take a closer look at that love displayed by the Samaritan. How does he love? I mean, if you can visualize him, he went to him, right? He stepped closer. Where the others stepped away, he stepped closer. He felt sadness for this man's condition. He realized his wounds needed to be taken care of, so he binds them. He uses his own clothing, or maybe some spare clothing he brought along, which means he was probably bleeding or had broken bones. He then gives up his wine and his oil. In those days, the wine was used to cleanse and disinfect. He gave up his own. He used the oil to soothe. You know, maybe for yourself or maybe for a family member or a close friend, but a stranger, an enemy, at this point, I mean, couldn't he justify it right now? Hey, I've done enough. I can move on. You know, someone will come upon him. He should make it. But again, I want you to think about us and our limits of our own compassion we impose on our lives and really measure it to the Samaritan. Because the compassion that the Samaritan showed was limitless. He then uses his own animal or his beast to transport him to an inn to get further care. He uses his own money to take care of this man and stays overnight with him. I mean, at this point, can we say, I've done enough? But then there's more, right? In verse 35, on the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave to the innkeeper to take care of him further when he left. Now, in those days, if you were to equate what 2 denarii would buy you, that would buy you a month to 2 months of care at that inn. That's how much it was. That's how much he was willing to sacrifice. And that's not it, because he also said, hey, when I return, if there's anything left, an open tab, I will pay you. I mean, this was ripe for someone to take advantage of. Yet he offered it, and it just further details the lengths this total stranger went to show compassion. Now, did the Samaritan ever question, is this man my neighbor? Did he ever say, let me think about that? It didn't matter. There were no qualifications. So let's stop and reflect here, right? Have you guys ever come across someone in need or stopped, not maybe in this situation, but something fairly similar of someone needing help, where we stopped what we were doing, we gave up our resources, we sacrificed our time and money, we tended to someone we didn't even know, someone we may not even liked, and given up even our money, 2 months worth, or maybe even more. You know who we do this for? Ourselves, right? We want the best for ourselves. We want the best care for ourselves. Wouldn't we go to great lengths to make sure our needs are fulfilled? Don't we do that? We want the best doctors. We want the best care. We want to spare no expense when it comes to that. We want to maximize our comfort for our family, for our friends, but for a stranger. So in finishing the story, Jesus asked the lawyer, which of these 3 was your neighbor? And he replied, rightly, the one who showed mercy. And Jesus said, now go and do the same. So let's finish this charge. Let's finish this charge from Jesus, right? Did he mean go now and do the same sometime? Did he say go now and do the same occasionally, or when things are good for you? His instructions were meant to imply you have to always do that. He was telling this lawyer, this love that I've just described to you, you need to do this always. Show mercy to even your enemy all the time. And although the story wasn't true, the point Jesus was trying to make is that none of us can love like this all the time. No one on this earth has ever loved like this all the time, except Jesus. You know, we show flashes of kindness and compassion, and I don't mean to beat us all up, but we all show kindness and compassion in some shape or form. But we can't love others with this limitless lavishness that this kind of the Samaritan displayed. Why? Because we love ourselves too much. You know, ever since that day in the garden that sin came into this world, selfishness gets in the way. So Jesus is giving this lawyer one more chance to say, Jesus, I can't do this. If this is what is required, if this law is unattainable, I can't follow it completely. I'm incapable of this kind of love. I mean, we want him to respond to this. Now we see that the story ends and we never hear that. But this would have been a wonderful admission. And I think we would all agree that if this kind of love all the time is what it takes for us to get into heaven, we wouldn't be getting there. I mean, I could never earn it. I mean, even as a Christian, I know many are in this room, I mean, we're supposed to love differently. But this kind of love all the time, it's just not possible. But thankfully, right, this is where grace comes in. And, you know, every time I hear that word grace, I smile because it just means so much. This love of God that we don't deserve. And that's really the whole point, right? You see, when God sent his son to die on the cross, he covered those sins. He covered our sins. He covered our imperfect ability to love God and others. This perfect love, you know where it'll exist? In heaven, right? That perfect love where all our needs are met. It's going to take on a whole new meaning when we get to heaven. But there was Jesus standing in front of this lawyer, giving him this charge to go and do the same. He was ready to hear this man admit that he falls short. He was ready to offer his forgiveness, ready to offer mercy, ready to offer grace to this lawyer. And as we mentioned, we just assume that he didn't. His heart was hard. If only he would realize, if we would realize that our lack of love is covered by Christ, who paid that penalty when he died on the cross. And so that brings me back to that New Year's resolution, right? Let's not focus on our actions, but let's focus on the act. The ultimate act, right, that Jesus displayed. Let's focus on that love letter that's found in here, right? Let's focus on the idea that as we read this more, we'll better understand that love that Jesus wants us to have. I believe the more we read, we'll understand what it means to love God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your soul. So if I could ask you to think about, when it comes to a New Year's resolution, think about this. You know, if you don't know Christ, I pray that you'll turn to him. I mean, if there's any resolution that is the most important one in the world, is to know that we all fall short, right? And if you know Christ as your Lord and Savior, my prayer is that your capacity to love just grows, right? That you see this as a point not to get bogged down in the mundane. I got to be better at this. I got to be better at that. Oh, man, I screwed up with this. I struggle with that. It's important to reflect, but I want you to reflect on the right thing. The more we reflect on his love that he has for us, man, the more that all those things are going to fall into place. The more our actions are going to follow, and we won't beat ourselves up. You know, when you hear this Good Samaritan story moving forward, I want you to think of the kindness, but I want you to remember that, man, I fall short. I'm not worthy, but thankfully through Jesus' death on the cross and his resurrection, we are. So with that, I want to just close in prayer. Let's bow our heads. Dear Lord, I just come to you now, just bearing my imperfections to you. We're not perfect. I'm not perfect.